Hi. So I'm going to be following up on something that Mihao said yesterday, that Kanban is deceptively simple. And one of the messages I want to get across is that Kanban is simple and it's also incredibly complicated. And I'm going to do that in part by breaking a number of Jürgen's rules, destroying my influence and credibility by sharing a bunch of really dumb stuff that I've done. Since context is important, those of you who don't know me should know that I'm the guy who used to do Pavel's job. And so for almost the last 10 years, I've been doing nothing but building web applications with Ruby on Rails. Over 100 web applications with Ruby on Rails with reasonably small teams of 4 to 7 people, reasonably small projects usually lasting under a year. So if you're building huge embedded systems for medical devices, you have to take the context into consideration when you're listening to my experiences, because we're not in a field that has best practices. Best practices only work in reasonably simple domains. But some of these ideas might be applicable, and some of the problems I've had, mistakes I've made, might be problems that you see and mistakes that you've seen. So to give a little context, I started a software company in Poland 9 years ago. And before that, I was doing big projects using waterfall development. And so the moment I had my own company, the very first thing that I did was start it as a Scrum company. And there are 3 major reasons for that. One is I'm lazy. And one of the things I didn't like about my job before was the enormous amount of grunt work involved, the long meetings, the hours writing documentation, the approvals process, and all of that. I like the idea of spreading the workload amongst everybody, having everybody sharing in the planning, sharing in the estimations, sharing in everything. Secondly, is I learned management in prison. And I'm not going to go and say that all rapists and drug dealers and murderers are stupid, but the ones who worked for me were the ones who were caught. And so when I got into software, all of a sudden I'm surrounded by these really, really smart people. And it seemed like the dumbest thing in the world that I could do as a mediocre manager is tell smarter people than me exactly what to do and how to do their jobs. So Scrum gave us an environment in which everybody could share and participate and bring a lot more to the table than just their coding skills. And thirdly, I hate conflict. I get into it a lot because I'm pretty idealistic, but I hate it. And conflict was a big part of my job when I was doing waterfall development, because a lot of my responsibility was tracking down and placing blame, apologizing for things over which I had no control, and telling clients what they couldn't have because it wasn't in the spec. And so the idea of having everybody involved in discovering problems, solving problems together, taking shared ownership of the entire process felt really good to me, and being completely transparent in it. Also, I am a bit of a process junkie. I'm an early adopter of every new idea. I was doing Pomodoro before the Pomodoro book came out. I was getting things done from the moment David Allen started talking about it. And when I read a few blog posts about Kanban a couple of years before David Anderson wrote the book, I was all over it. And we had some people who were free, who weren't working on anything, some really talented people, and I said, let's try this on something internal. And I thought Kanban sounded really cool, and I thought it was likely going to catch on. And I thought, if we end up doing this, we're going to need some kind of a tool for collaborating with our offshore clients. And so why don't we experiment with Kanban by building a tool for collaborating on an online Kanban board? And so we started building Kanbanery back in 2008, I think it was, maybe 2007. And we did it using Kanban. One of the first big mistakes I made, because there was no real literature on Kanban, so I wasn't aware that this was a big mistake, is I violated one of the first principles of starting with what you do now. Because I had adopted Scrum and done Scrum for years during that awkward period in Scrum's development, when it faced its first crisis, which was the Scrum butt crisis of having lots of people doing it poorly and complaining that it didn't work, and there was a reaction against that. As a result, I was a very dogmatic Scrum Master. doing Scrum by the book. And I took that to Kanban and said, let's do Kanban by the book. There are 3 rules, just 3 rules. We throw everything out and we'll only add what we need. And within a couple of weeks, we had brought back a lot of the Scrum practices that worked really well for us because it hurt to get rid of them. But everybody knows better than that now. The first thing that happened, I want to do an illustration here. Are there any Scrum Masters here? A few? Could you give me a hand? Partially because I don't have 3 of them. Come up here. And partially because I haven't drawn a burn down chart in years.
Okay.
Could you take my burn down chart over here, and I'll show you what was happening and why it was happening. Imagine this scenario. Small web project, 2 developers, 1 tester. Tasks are all pretty much the same size. They take about 2 days to develop, about a day to test. Okay? That's the scenario. So on day 1, both developers grab their tasks and start working on them. At the end of day 1, it looks like this, right?
So I'll start drawing?
If you would.
We start at 10 points?
Yes, at 10. Day 2, they're still working on these tasks because they take about 2 days. So at the end of day 2, it looks like this, but they're both finishing. And they throw these at QA and go home. On day 3, they come in and take 2 new tasks. And QA starts testing. It takes about a day to test. So QA finds a couple of bugs in this task. So the end of day 3 looks like this. Day 4, these 2 developers are still working on these features, and the tester goes and tests the next feature and finds a couple of bugs. So at the end of day 4, it looks like this. On day 5, at the end of day 4, they throw these things over here and grab a couple of new things. And even if, let's say one of the developers doesn't, one of the developers goes and fixes these 2 bugs. And the tester comes in, and so he starts testing a new task. And let's pretend, just for the sake of argument, that all these things are so incredibly trivial that fixing bugs and regressing bugs takes no time at all. But they don't task switch, so the tester is working on this task today. So this is waiting for regression testing, and that developer can then go and grab a new task. So at the end of day, what are we at, 5? Yep. It looks like this. Now, if you extrapolate this out, you'll see that if we're doing a 2-week sprint, at the end of the first week, there's nothing happening. And then you can probably imagine, we won't go through the entire exercise, that this first task gets done on day 6, the first day of the 2nd week. So you get this kind of plunging burn down chart. Has anyone seen that chart? The one that just goes like this. Is that a common phenomenon? Raise your hand if you've seen this chart. I lived with this for 2 years. I knew it was painful. I hated explaining it to clients. First-time clients were always scared to death for the first week. And there's 2 problems with this. The first one I solved in a bad way. I solved it by saying this is normal, it's okay, and then after a few iterations they start seeing this pattern and they stop being so scared. But the other problem is bigger, and that is that if there is a problem, we don't see it in our metrics because an iteration that's going well and an iteration that's going poorly both generate the exact same burn down chart for the first 3 quarters of the iteration. And so I hadn't found a clever solution to this, and I know that these days probably a lot of Scrum teams have found the solution because it's one of the practices that I only came to know about because of Kanban, and that is limiting WIP. So if you go through this exact same exercise with WIP limits on development and QA, but all the other rules exactly the same, what you get is on day 1 and 2, the developers are working on their first 2 tasks. So it looks exactly the same for day 1, day 2, same thing. The tester pulls a task when it's finished. Now this is done too, but the tester can't pull it. So one of the developers comes to work with nothing to do. This is done. They can either pair on this, or a developer can sit down with a tester and fix bugs and have them regressed as they're found. And so what ends up happening is a tester and a developer work together on day 3 and knock that out, and the developer can pull a new task, and then the tester can get this in, and the developer can work on it. Can you see the difference already? By day 3, we start actually delivering completed features. And what ends up happening is not necessarily dramatically increased productivity, but you get to see things happening a lot sooner. You get to actually deliver working features a lot sooner. There are some improvements in efficiency because obviously all of you who are coders, and even those of you who aren't, can probably imagine it's a lot easier to fix bugs in code that you just wrote than to fix bugs in code that you wrote 2 days ago and you've done another feature since then, because you're coming back to something and changing your context. So what you end up seeing is not only a much earlier vision of what's happening, and you see problems emerging a lot earlier, but it also begins to position you for the first step towards continuous deployment and being able to get value to your end users faster than if you had to wait until the end of that plunge and you fix all the bugs that were found during the iteration. So that was my first big epiphany. Thank you very much. That was my first big epiphany. And one of the nice things about that is if you're on a Scrum team and you're seeing those kinds of burn down charts, whip limits work in Scrum. You don't have, and they don't have to be whip limits. Other Scrum teams have developed rules like nobody can work on 2 tasks at once. Finish what you start, and which is a kind of way of imposing whip limits on a team. But that's one of the early values that I saw. Another of the dumb things that I was doing had to do with continuous improvement. Let me ask you a few questions. How many people, raise your hands, if you do retrospectives on your project at least once a month? So it looks like more than half of you do retrospectives at least once a month. Keep them up if you do them every 2 weeks. Okay, it looks like everybody who does them at least once a month also does them every 2 weeks. Every week? All right, a few of you have weekly retrospectives. We tended to do 2-week retrospectives, and since the purpose of a retrospective is to identify opportunities for improvement and making those improvements, we tended to find 1 or 2 things that we wanted to change every retrospective, which means one of my teams would make about 100 changes or more to their processes every year. And those changes tended to fall into one of 3 general categories. Either they had a problem, they identified a possible solution, they implemented it, and it didn't fix the problem. But the problem didn't come up in the next retrospective, and so they just kept doing this thing that didn't work and forgot why they were doing it. Or it solved the problem, and it solved the problem so brilliantly that it worked perfectly for long enough that they forgot why they were doing it and why it solved the problem. And people would go away on holiday and such, and then we'd start getting to work again, and we'd kind of forget about doing that particular thing. And then a few months down the line, the problem would come up in a retrospective, and we think, wait, we had something for this. And then the third is things that partially solve the problem. Still cause some pain, but not enough pain for it to come up in a retrospective for a while. So we're adding all of these things and changing all of these things. And I've always been strongly motivated to produce quality software. It's one of the things that my company is known for. I think it's a very important differentiator, and I think about this a lot. And I tend to think of software quality in 4 categories. 2 of them are the classic software craftsmanship categories, and that is, are we writing clean code that is following the coding standards that we've decided to adhere to and utilizes industry standard practices that other developers would recognize if they saw it? Because since we do offshore development for other people, we know that most of our work is going to be maintained by somebody else. So we don't want to write brilliantly clever code that only we could understand. So is the code, adequately tested, and is the test automation flexible enough and comprehensive enough, et cetera, et cetera. Is the architecture stable and maintainable and extendable such that somebody's not going to have to throw this away and start over from scratch in 5 years? But then also, is the user experience as pleasant as it can be? Is if the users don't enjoy the experience, I don't consider that to be quality software. And does it really satisfy the real requirements? Are the stakeholders finding that the problems that they're paying to have the software developed to meet are actually being met? And so what I did is I made this chart. I made a nice one, which you can download from my website, and each team had it printed in a big A0 giant poster up on their wall. And at a retrospective, when we would come across a problem or something that we wanted to improve, it was interesting to find that we could always track the problem to where it impacted one of these areas of quality. It might be a communication difficulty with the client, which led us to develop a feature in not quite the way that they expected. Or it may be the difficulties it's taking longer and longer to run the tests or what have you. But whatever problem it was, it usually mapped to one of these areas. And so at each retrospective, we'd come up with one or maybe two ideas. We'd write them down on a Post-it and put them in the appropriate place. And we'd write down what we're going to change, what we expected to happen, and if we thought it was going to take more time to get real feedback, we'd write down a deadline for evaluating this change. Otherwise, the default was just the next retrospective. So at any given point in time, there's usually one or two experiments going on in every team. And then at the next retrospective, the first thing we do is say, how are these experiments working? And if it didn't work, we'd cancel the experiment, find a different solution, and put that on as a different experiment. If it worked pretty well, but we could improve it, then we'll adapt it and we'll run the adapted experiment for another iteration. And if it worked brilliantly and everyone was convinced this is something we should make part of our standard practice, we would write it down in ink, experiment successful. And in that way, we built up a set of standard quality practices that addressed all four of these four dimensions of software quality, which were unique to each team. And one of the big advantages of this is, number one, we remembered what we were doing and why. We threw away things that didn't work as well as they could, because we were coming back and reevaluating all of our experiments. And by having it on a huge wall board, other teams could see how different teams in the company were addressing some of the same areas of quality that they needed to address. Now, these are context specific, so even in a company where you've got only Ruby on Rails teams only doing Ruby on Rails web application development, different teams are going to have different needs, but they can learn from each other and get ideas from each other through a process like this. I've got to apologize, I forgot to set my timer. I have this clever timer, but I don't know how much time I've got left. Okay, I'm doing pretty well here. So I can go to the next thing that I learned from adopting Kanban. The biggest pain point in trying to limit WIP when you're first adopting Kanban is when you run into your first bottleneck. And we ran into our first bottleneck within a couple of weeks, because it was a small team. We were working with the employees that we had available who weren't on client projects. And so, of necessity, that meant we had 3 programmers and we had 1 tester. And I used to be proud of the fact that we had gotten our practices to the point where it was normal for us to have 1 or 2, maybe 3 small issues come up in testing for each major feature that we completed, which was a big improvement from my days in my previous company when we were maintaining lists of bugs that would be fixed someday. And it had been this way for a few years, and we thought that this was normal. But when we adopted reasonably tight WIP limits in this team that had only 1 tester for 3 developers, within just a little over a week, testing became a bottleneck, because there's so many little things that had to be regressed before we could get those items out of testing. And there's a lot of overhead associated with that, with regression testing even reasonably simple bugs. And so the team came to me and they said, this isn't going to work. We need to hire another tester. And I really like options. I believe that most problems have multiple solutions. And so I said, let's try to come up with at least 3 ways of addressing this problem, and then decide which one's going to work best. And so another obvious option was take some of the developers off the team so that we don't have more developers developing code than the tester can test. And the third thing we did is took a close look at the kind of bugs that we were finding, which was easy to do because we had a big Kanban board on the wall and the bugs were just these stickies, and we just looked through them. And we discovered pretty quickly that the vast majority of bugs were really simple little things that fell into 2 categories, i.e. bugs or stupid shit. Things like, because of a typo someplace, the submit button doesn't show up on a form. All the tests pass and everything works, but the user can't actually click a submit button. Oh yeah. Things that would be caught really easily, but not so easily by the guy who's been focused on the task for 2 days. So what we decided to do was to add another quality practice. We added a new column to our Kanban board in between development and testing, which was hallway testing. We just decided that somebody other than the programmer who did the work would just try to use the feature on a Windows laptop. So instead of hiring a new full-time tester, I bought a 1,000 zloty Windows laptop and gave it to the team. And then every single feature before it went to testing, they grabbed some guy, somebody going to get a cup of coffee, somebody on the team who was in between tasks, anybody, and just said, here, take a look at this for me. And all of a sudden, a miracle happened. The developers started getting feedback on these simple little bugs, like, that word's misspelled, or this doesn't have a submit button, or the rounded corners don't look right, because that was a big problem in IE back then. It didn't handle CSS rounded corners the way every other browser did. But we were catching all of those things right when the code was fresh in the developer's mind and when they had it open in their IDE. And they could just quickly fix and say, okay, take a look at it now. And okay, yeah, that works. And all of a sudden, things just started blazing through testing. The tester would just say, yeah, that works. And they were going out to production straight away. So that was another one of those improvements that would not necessarily have been possible had we not changed the constraints within which we were working. And now it's gone across the company, and our average bugs per feature, we've got metrics on this, is like 1 bug per every 3 or 4 features actually gets caught in testing. We'd like to get that down more, and when we see patterns in the kind of bugs that we have, especially within a single team, they might look for quality practices that will prevent those from happening. Well, something else about the quality chart. One of the ways that we evaluate all of our quality practices is on a kind of continuum where the worst kind of quality practice is something that catches a quality problem before it goes out to users. It's a quality control practice that allows you to and this is what a lot of us do at the very end, just manual testing. But the best kind of quality practice is one that keeps a problem from ever coming up in the first place. This might be better conversations with clients to better understand requirements before any work gets done or what have you. And as much as possible, we try to always make our quality practices aimed at the quality assurance end, which is a practice that changes the way the team works so that problems never get introduced in the first place. And I've got one more thing if we still have time. We do. I've got 5 more minutes. And then there was one other phenomenon that I saw happening, especially in larger Kanban teams. When you're focusing mostly on flow, you don't have this problem in Scrum because you commit to a set of work and then you get it all done in a time box. But when you're focusing mostly on flow and you've got a physical board, a phenomenon happens sometimes where something will get blocked, either for a really good reason or for a dumb reason. Sometimes things are blocked for a known reason. We need this person, somebody's on vacation, whatever. And so you can label it as blocked. But even there, if you've got a task that's blocked and is labeled as blocked, it doesn't prevent flow. Things just flow around it. And after a while, the team can get used to that. Which is a problem, because if everything's being done in the order of priority, that means lower priority items are constantly flowing past a higher priority item, which is being ignored and forgotten. And we found a really simple way to deal with this with a physical board, and that is that at the stand-up meeting every day, while we're standing in front of the board, everything that's in progress, we just put a dot on it. And so something that's been in process for a couple of days gets 2 dots. And then something that's been in progress for a while longer, you can imagine, after a while, you start seeing something like this. It starts becoming blatantly obvious that one of the tasks has more dots than any of the others. It's an amazingly simple technique, and it has 2 advantages. One, it calls attention to things that are not moving, not flowing through the system, even though the system is still flowing work through. And the other thing is you can start seeing your lead time very visually. You can just look at your completed column and say, oh, this task had a lead time of 2 days, and this task had a lead time of 1 day. This one apparently less than 1 day. So we tried to translate that into an electronic tool, because I know a lot of people have to use electronic tools because they have distributed teams. And I think that a few other tools, other than our own Kanbanery, do something like this now, where if a task is in a column, different companies, I guess, use different metrics, but if it's in a column on average longer than other tasks tend to be in that column, its color starts to change. It starts looking a bit stale. So this is an Agile by Example conference, and usually I talk about theoretical stuff, so it's kind of interesting to be able to talk about things that I've actually done, and especially dumb things that I've done and mistakes that I've made. And I think that in the course of the last 10 years, these are the things that I'm most embarrassed for allowing to go on in my company so long. The Scrum burndown charts that didn't deliver value until the end of the sprint, the stale tasks that people just forgot were sitting there, and the quality practices that didn't work that we kept doing, and the quality practices that did work that we stopped doing for reasons nobody could understand or remember. I think these are the 3 most painful, dumbest things that I have done and allowed to happen sometimes for years in what is otherwise a company that I'm really, really proud of. So if any of you are having the exact same experiences in your teams now or in the future, these are a few ideas that have actually worked for us, and I hope you find them helpful. If you've got better ideas, please blog about them and tweet them to the whole group so we can all learn from them. And if you think any of these are really stupid, or something you've got some questions about how they worked and how they might work in different contexts, please grab me aside. I'm not going to be running away after lunch today during any of the breaks. I hope that's been helpful for you.